the reality of energy dependency in the United States has been largely disguised behind political slogans, economic optimism, and the spectacle of technological ambition. For years, the narrative sold to the public was that the country had achieved energy independence through a combination of domestic drilling, fracking booms, and the accelerated growth of renewable energy sources. This message was repeated so often that it became a kind of national myth embraced across political lines as proof of American resilience and self-sufficiency. Yet beneath that rhetoric lies a more sobering truth: the infrastructure and capacity of the U.S. energy sector, while vast, is not sufficient to power the scale of operations now being demanded by the rapidly expanding artificial intelligence industry. These AI data centers are not just another consumer of electricity, they are industrial scale consumers, devouring enormous amounts of power every hour, day after day, without interruption. The computing processes behind machine learning, training large language models, and processing immense data sets require a constant, stable, and high-capacity energy supply. This demand is further compounded by the need for cooling systems that themselves require significant electricity to operate, meaning the energy footprint of a single AI facility can rival that of an entire small city. Canada, with its abundant hydroelectric resources, vast oil sands, and substantial reserves of natural gas, stands out as one of the few neighboring partners capable of meeting such a demand consistently. This is not simply about proximity. Canada's energy infrastructure is deeply intertwined with the U.S. through shared grids, cross-border pipelines, and long-standing trade agreements. That interconnection makes Canada an indispensable supplier in times of heightened consumption. But energy dependency is not just a technical matter, it is political leverage. In a world where resource nationalism is resurging, where nations are increasingly prioritizing domestic consumption and strategic advantage over open export markets, Canada's role in supplying energy to the U.S. takes on a new and pressing significance. The assumption that Canadian resources will always be available for American industries without question is outdated. Ottawa is aware of its strategic position and understands the bargaining power it holds when Washington's technological aspirations hinge on uninterrupted energy flows. For the U.S., this dependency exposes a vulnerability that cannot be ignored. The speed at which AI technology is advancing means that delays in securing stable energy supplies could slow development, disrupt timelines, and weaken the competitive edge the country seeks to maintain over rivals like China and the European Union. Energy dependency also creates a scenario where geopolitical and trade considerations spill directly into the domain of technological leadership. If the U.S. wants to keep its AI sector running at full throttle, it must confront the reality that no matter how many billions it invests in servers, software, and research, without secure and sufficient power, much of it imported, those investments risk sitting idle. The notion of independence fades, replaced by the recognition of interdependence, where the ability to innovate is as much about diplomacy and negotiation as it is about engineering breakthroughs. Canada's strategic leverage in the current energy negotiations with the United States is rooted in both its resource abundance and its unique geopolitical position. Unlike many resource-rich nations that are far from U.S. markets or politically unstable, Canada is directly connected to American infrastructure through a dense network of pipelines, electricity grids, and trade corridors. This connectivity means that Canadian energy does not face the same logistical hurdles, shipping risks, or geopolitical choke points that oil from the Middle East or liquefied natural gas from Asia might encounter. The result is a reliable and relatively low cost supply that is perfectly positioned to serve the enormous and growing needs of U.S. industries, especially the energy hungry AI sector. But in the current climate, reliability alone is not the whole story. Canada's leadership understands that the demand from the U.S. for stable, large scale energy supplies puts Ottawa in a rare position of bargaining strength where it can seek policy concessions, trade advantages, or environmental agreements that align with its national priorities. This leverage is amplified by the fact that the global energy landscape has shifted dramatically in recent years. The era of assuming infinite global supply chains has ended. Countries are increasingly prioritizing domestic needs, protecting their own industries, and using resources as tools of foreign policy. In this environment, Canada's ability to decide how much energy to export, to whom, and under what terms gives it influence far beyond the raw dollar value of the trade itself. For Washington, this is an uncomfortable reality because it runs counter to decades of treating Canada as a dependable supplier who would rarely, if ever, attach political strings to its exports. That perception is changing. As Canada strengthens its own energy security policies, it can also choose to link energy cooperation with broader issues such as environmental protections, emissions targets, and even industrial participation in sectors like AI and clean technology. For the US, facing a tight timeline to power massive AI infrastructure, this means Canada's leverage is not just about resources, it's about timing. Canada can afford to negotiate slowly, weighing its options and considering offers from multiple partners, while the US faces the pressure of project deadlines and competitive threats from other nations racing ahead in AI development. This imbalance in urgency tilts the negotiation table in Canada's favor. It allows Ottawa to set terms that might previously have been unthinkable, such as guaranteed Canadian participation in certain USE based tech ventures, preferential treatment for Canadian exports in unrelated sectors, or long term commitments to purchase other Canadian goods and services alongside energy agreements. In short, the leverage lies not only in what Canada has, but in when and how it chooses to provide it, making the flow of electrons and barrels as much a political act as an economic transaction. The shift from assumption to negotiation marks one of the most significant changes in the U.S. Canada energy relationship in decades. For a long time, American policymakers and industries operated under the quiet but firm belief that Canadian energy would always be available in whatever quantity was needed, whenever it was needed, and at prices that reflected a shared economic partnership rather than hard-nosed market competition. This mindset was reinforced by decades of close political ties, trade agreements like NAFTA and its successor, and the sheer geographic convenience of a stable, resource-rich neighbor. But that sense of inevitability is fading. The rapid escalation in U.S. energy demand, driven in large part by the explosive growth of artificial intelligence infrastructure, has altered the dynamics. Instead of an unspoken understanding, the relationship is entering an era where every unit of energy is a subject of negotiation, every pipeline contract is subject to new conditions, and every supply commitment is weighed against competing priorities, both domestic and international. From the Canadian perspective, this is not simply a matter of selling resources to a customer. It is a question of long-term strategy, economic diversification, and national interest. Ottawa can no longer justify automatically allocating massive amounts of its energy capacity to the US without considering how that decision impacts its own industries, climate targets, and strategic positioning in the global economy. As renewable energy projects expand within Canada, there is also a growing domestic demand for electricity and a political push to keep more of that clean power within national borders. This doesn't mean cutting off exports entirely, but it does mean rethinking the terms under which they occur. Negotiations can now involve broader considerations: how the US approaches environmental regulations, whether Canadian firms gain preferential access to American technology markets, or whether new infrastructure projects are co-developed to benefit both economies. For the US, this is a complex adjustment. It must transition from the habit of treating Canadian energy as a given to engaging in a more balanced, transactional dialogue where both sides expect tangible benefits. This requires not only policy changes, but also a shift in mindset among business leaders and government officials. The days of assuming that Canadian oil, gas, and electricity would simply flow southward without question are over. Now, American negotiators must enter discussions prepared to make concessions, align with Canadian policy priorities, and recognize that their northern partner has options, including redirecting certain exports to other markets or using its energy surplus to power its own economic transformation. The move from assumption to negotiation reflects a broader reality of today's interconnected world. Even the closest allies must navigate their relationships through the lens of self-interest, strategic leverage, and the demands of a rapidly changing global energy market. Political rhetoric in the United States has long painted a picture of energy independence as both an achievable goal and a reality already within grasp. Politicians across the spectrum have pointed to domestic drilling booms, the expansion of shale gas production, and the rise of renewable energy projects as proof that the country could meet its own energy needs without relying heavily on imports. This narrative has been useful for campaign speeches and for reinforcing a sense of national strength, but it has consistently ignored the complex and interconnected reality of modern energy markets. The US may produce vast quantities of oil and gas, but the infrastructure, cost structures, and consumption patterns tied to its economy mean that foreign energy, particularly from Canada, remains deeply woven into its daily functioning. The illusion of independence thrives because the physical flow of energy across borders happens quietly, without fanfare, in pipelines, power lines, and trade routes that the public rarely sees or thinks about. The economic truth is that interdependence is not a weakness, but a fundamental feature of the North American energy system. Shared electricity grids between the US and Canada allow power to flow in both directions depending on demand and pricing. Cross-border pipelines carry millions of barrels of crude oil and refined products every day, feeding refineries, transportation networks, and industries on both sides of the border. Natural gas infrastructure similarly binds the two economies, ensuring that spikes in demand, whether from extreme weather or industrial surges, can be met with supply flexibility. This arrangement has worked for decades because it has been mutually beneficial. The U.S. gains stable and relatively affordable imports, while Canada secures a dependable market for its resources. Yet the AI driven surge in energy demand changes the weight of this balance, making the U.S. more dependent than ever on maintaining these flows without disruption. Recognizing this interdependence requires confronting the gap between public perception and policy reality. When leaders claim that America's energy security rests solely on its domestic output, they overlook the ways in which trade relationships and cross border coordination make that security possible. Canadian hydroelectricity, for example, provides clean, renewable power that helps balance U.S. grids, particularly during peak consumption periods. Without it, the U.S. would need to turn to more expensive or more polluting sources to fill the gap. Similarly, the heavy crude imported from Canada plays a critical role in keeping certain American refineries operating efficiently, as their systems are designed specifically for that feedstock. Removing these imports would not simply be an inconvenience. It would require costly reconfigurations and likely drive up energy prices across multiple sectors. The political challenge lies in reconciling the nationalist appeal of independence with the strategic benefits of acknowledged interdependence. In the context of AI development, this is not an academic debate, it is a pressing operational reality. Data centers cannot afford unstable power supplies, and the scale of their energy needs makes cross-border flows not just useful but essential. The rapid expansion of artificial intelligence states has created a paradox in which cutting edge technological progress is dependent on something as traditional and tangible as a stable energy supply. Data centers powering AI systems are among the most energy intensive facilities in the modern economy. They require not just large amounts of electricity to run their processors, but also continuous cooling to keep servers from overheating, which adds another significant layer to their power demands. Unlike other industries that can adjust production schedules or reduce operations during supply constraints, AI facilities must operate at full capacity around the clock to train and refine algorithms, process massive data sets, and deliver instant results to end users. A brief disruption or power shortage can stall weeks or months of computational work, delay product releases, and compromise the competitive edge that companies are racing to achieve in this sector. This dependency on uninterrupted energy supply means that the AI boom cannot be viewed in isolation from the energy sector. It ties the future of high tech development directly to the availability and stability of electricity, and by extension, to the countries and regions capable of providing it reliably. In this context, Canada's role as a supplier becomes far more than a matter of convenience. Canadian hydroelectric power offers a renewable, low carbon option that can be integrated directly into U.S. grids, reducing the environmental impact of AI operations while also providing steady output. Similarly, Canada's oil and natural gas reserves contribute to maintaining baseline power availability, especially during times when renewable sources face seasonal or weather-related fluctuations. These resources, combined with well establish cross-border infrastructure, position Canada as an indispensable partner in sustaining the operational tempo of U.S. AI development. The vulnerability lies in the fact that energy availability is not purely a market transaction. It is influenced by political decisions, trade agreements, environmental regulations, and shifting national priorities. If Canada decides to allocate more of its renewable power to domestic industries or to link energy exports to environmental or economic concessions, U.S. data centers may find themselves facing constraints they have little control over. This risk becomes even more pronounced when multiple sectors, from manufacturing to transportation, are competing for the same finite supply of power. In such a scenario, AI facilities, despite their strategic importance, may not automatically receive priority. The reliance on Canadian energy also exposes a longer-term structural issue. The U.S. has not yet built enough domestic clean energy capacity to match the anticipated growth of AI-driven demand. Even with aggressive investments in solar, wind, and nuclear, the scale of what is needed will take years, if not decades, to achieve. In the meantime, the industry will continue to depend heavily on external partners to bridge the gap between aspiration and capability. This creates a strategic vulnerability in which the success of one of America's most advanced technological sectors is ultimately tied to the political and economic decisions of another country. In the current negotiations over energy supply for U.S. artificial intelligence projects, the balance of power has shifted in a way that is unusual for the relationship between Washington and Ottawa. Historically, the United States has approached cross-border energy arrangements from a position of assumed dominance, confident that Canada's economic dependence on American markets would ensure a steady flow of oil, gas, and electricity without the need for major concessions. That dynamic is now changing. The urgency driving U.S. policymakers and corporate leaders to secure, stable, large-scale energy for AI data centers means that time is no longer on their side. Canada, by contrast, faces no such immediate deadline. It can afford to wait, evaluate its options, and weigh any offers against its own domestic and strategic priorities. This shift in urgency effectively hands Canada a negotiating advantage, allowing it to set terms that might previously have been dismissed as unrealistic. This reversal is partly the result of global changes in energy politics. Supply is no longer treated as an endlessly tradable commodity in a frictionless global market. Nations are increasingly using their resources to advance broader policy goals, strengthen domestic industries, and secure strategic alliances. In this context, Canada can link its willingness to export large amounts of energy to the U.S. with other objectives, such as gaining preferential treatment for Canadian technology firms in U.S. markets, securing joint investments in renewable infrastructure, or influencing environmental policy decisions south of the border. The U.S., under pressure to keep AI projects on schedule and competitive with developments in other countries, may find itself agreeing to terms that would have been politically or economically unpalatable in the past. The psychological element of this shift is also significant. For decades, American negotiators have been accustomed to setting the pace and parameters of talks with Canada, often framing the relationship as one where the U.S. had the leverage due to its larger economy and broader global reach. Now, the roles are reversed. The commodity in question, reliable, large-scale energy is controlled by Canada and the demand is on the US side. This creates a scenario where even small delays or hesitations from Ottawa can create ripple effects in Washington's planning, from corporate investment decisions to federal infrastructure strategies. This new balance has long-term implications for how both nations approach not just energy, but technology, trade, and security. If Canada successfully uses its leverage in this instance, it may set a precedent for future negotiations in other sectors, encouraging a more assertive Canadian stance in bilateral dealings. For the US, it may serve as a reminder that economic scale alone does not guarantee negotiating power, especially when the resource in question is critical, finite, and tied to high stakes industries like artificial intelligence.